Today's presentation is brought to you by a partnership between TLPI and Red Wind. So we're so grateful to be able to bring this to you today. And with that, I'll go ahead and let Kelly introduce herself first and say a little bit more about herself, and then we'll continue.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. Can you hear me okay, Heather?
Yes.
Great, because I had to move into my kitchen. So I'm sitting here doing this from my kitchen table. I'm Kelly Stoner. I'm a victim advocacy legal specialist with TLPI. I've worked there for over 10 years. And just a little bit about my background. I spent over 20 years teaching in law schools on American Indian law related issues. I was a tribal judge for 8 years for the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. I've been a tribal prosecutor and many other facets. In those occupations, I was able to draft codes. I drafted some codes for some tribes in North Dakota and here in Oklahoma, just on a variety of different issues. So I'm well aware of the challenges, and hopefully today we've put together a really nice introduction package, because Heather pointed out that this is a series, and we'll give you some general baseline things to think about today and kind of get down further in the weeds in part 2. So Heather, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you so we can get started. Oh, we're missing Chia too today. We should probably, for folks who have that kind of personality, like what's that third picture? She's not here. Chia wasn't able to join us today, so it's just going to be Kelly, myself, and Heather.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. And we hope Chia can join us in future webinars in the series. She leads up a lot of our intertribal working group work with around VAWA and special tribal criminal jurisdiction, tribes interested or implementing that. So we're looking forward to having Chia on in the future. And just to say a little bit more about myself, I'm an enrolled citizen of San Alfonso Pueblo and a descendant of the Navajo Nation and Mexican peoples. I am zooming to you today from Serrano, Yohaviatam Clan territory, the Seminole Band of Mission Indians. And we're so excited to bring this to you. I first started working with codes and tribal code development as a law student in UCLA's Tribal Legal Clinic, working with tribes around tribal code development issues, and have been working with TLPI and other folks since then around code drafting projects. So just so honored to be able to share some foundational information with you today. And with that, we'll start with just going over some of the topics that we'll be focusing on today. Just a general overview of tribal code development, talk about approaches to drafting, some general tips, maybe some consideration questions you might want to ask yourself as you think about drafting code, as well as have a question and answer session and share some resources. Okay, so to start us off, just sharing a little bit about TLPI's philosophy around tribal code development. TLPI has been around for over 25 years, providing training and technical assistance in a variety of areas regarding tribal empowerment and capacity building. Laws should really be coming from the community. Attorneys and lawyers like Kelly and myself don't necessarily have all the answers when it comes to drafting laws and code, but we could be very beneficial and essential to the code drafting process. But really the heart of the code and the purpose behind why the code is being enacted, that lies within the community. So TLPI's philosophy is about providing tools and examples from other tribal codes that help tribes facilitate discussion, as well as really think about how these laws, because these laws, which we're going to get into a little bit today, are a reflection of the tribal community, the tribal issues that folks are seeing in their communities, but also can be a reflection of tribal custom, values, traditions around certain topics, depending on what the code is focused on, right? So TLPI's philosophy, laws should come from the community. Lawyers are necessary, but not essential, or not essentially having all the answers, I should say. They are beneficial in providing that legal advice to folks as they're crafting code and of being assistants to leadership and tribal code drafting teams. And so with that in mind, TLPI has plenty of tribal legal code resources that are free and downloadable on our website, and they cover a wide range of topics, and we'll be going over a few today in our resources slide. But just to share that with you, as that's our organizational approach when we're talking about tribal code drafting, it really does need to be community centered. Okay, so we like starting out with this talk about exercising sovereignty. The enaction of laws, the passing of laws for tribal communities is one ways that tribes continue to exercise their sovereignty. Tribal codes, when we say tribal codes, that means tribal law, right? Those are the laws that are being enforced in the community. Those are the laws that are governing behaviors, governing tribal responses. So they're all legally enforceable with tribal systems of justice. And those systems may look different depending on each community. But tribal codes are really a powerful, powerful exercise of tribal sovereignty. And what's pictured here is a living treaty, the two-row wampum, which may look very familiar to our folks. And it's from the Onondaga Nation. And it was a visual representation, a living treaty of the partnership and the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. So the Haudenosaunee explained to the Dutch that they did not use paper to record their history. They recorded it using wampum shells. And so the design here, this is a grayed out scaled photo, but the photo is made of, or the treaty is made of white and purple wampum shells. And they made the design so that it looks as if the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch are walking together, or actually flowing together on a river in a boat, and really signifying that each nation is separate and individual, but they are moving together with the promises and items outlined in their treaty. So we like to share this image and for folks to really think about ways that their tribal communities have historically notated partnerships, treaty agreements, political dealings, because those can all be really insightful in thinking about contemporary processes of code development. I did see one question in the chat. Is this webinar recorded for later viewing? Yes, it will be. Thank you so much for that question. And thank you everyone for joining us. I was just reading everybody's chat intros. Seems like we've got folks from a wide variety of places today. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, Kelly, anything to add here on this slide?
No, that was interesting. Thank you.
Okay. And from here, I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Okay, so this is a chart that was developed by our friend and colleague, Michelle Rivard Parks from the Tribal Judicial Institute. And just some concepts about codes that you kind of need to keep in your mind here, especially when we get down to the piece in part 2, when we're talking about custom and tradition. Codes, and Heather said you can also use the word laws, you can also use the word tribal statutes, are formal. That means that they're written. A lot of times in certain tribal communities, a lot of things are handled and addressed orally, and that's a tradition. But with respect to codes, the statutes that your judge will be interpreting and applying to the citizens in your tribal community, we're thinking of those as being formal, and they are legally enforceable rules or laws or statutes. They will also be regulating conduct. And that's one of the reasons Heather was stressing this really needs to come from your tribal community. We need to think about what kinds of issues are you encountering right now that you feel like you need a written enforceable statute to back it up. And so it's going to be conduct that you're seeing that's not acceptable in your tribal community. That's sort of a negative perspective. Something's happening, something bad. You need to draft a code to address it. It can also be, though, something positive. I need to if a victim of domestic violence is going to have to go through the criminal justice process, we want that victim to have some statutes with her rights that the judge, if requested, the judge can legally enforce. Okay, so we're thinking about those sorts of things. Also, the prohibitive conduct, that's going to be the criminal part. And again, these are going to be enforceable in your tribal court or whatever tribal forum that has the responsibility to enforce these. I don't know what's happening to my computer. I'm pushing on. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the Quapaw Nation Tribal Court. We're going to move from tribal sovereignty, enforcing your code of conduct, and the rights that you determine are important in civil or criminal cases. That is an act of sovereignty. We're going to move over into the tribal code and enforcing the code. This is going to include possibly many people. It's going to include your tribal judge, of course, attorneys, tribal prosecutors, defendants, law enforcement. There's just a whole host of folks that are going to be able to use these tribal codes as they're written and request the judge to enforce them, request relief that is authorized through the particular code. So again, this is Quapaw Nation. Heather and I visited this court, doing a feasibility study for them, and we were wonderfully received. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm glad we have this picture. It brings back good memories. So you're thinking also tribal sovereignty and tribal court. Can we move to the next one? Oh, yes. I did want to say a word though also. I gave you that kind of short list of who might be looking to enforce these tribal codes, because the majority of my career has been centered around working on domestic violence against Native women and children in state courts, tribal courts. I think it's really important to remember that your tribal advocates most likely are the ones that are going to be seeking enforcement of some of these tribal codes, especially your victims' rights codes for criminal cases. And so I want to acknowledge that for all the advocates that are out there. Advocates will be using these codes as well. And so all those people we just named and many more probably might need to be at the table. Heather's going to talk about teamwork later. You need to get that essential team together to get the voice from all of these folks about what would be helpful. Okay. Heather, I'm going to have you do the poll question simply because I just got a notice that my battery is going dead.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelly. And since we got the chat enabled, we'll go ahead and convert this poll question into a chat question. And as Kelly mentioned, and as we've discussed just in this previous slide here, as one example, picturing the Quapaw Tribal Court as one justice system that community has in place to enforce their laws, there are other venues or forums that could be in place to enact justice within the community. So we wanted to ask and see if anybody would like to share, what mechanisms does your tribe have in place for the enforcement of tribal law? These can be things like peacemaking processes, elders councils, matriarch or grandmothers forums. These can really range depending on community need. And so we were curious with our folks today that are on the webinar, if you can share what mechanisms your tribe has in place for enforcing tribal law. And it could be tribal court, right? Or a specialized court. And so we are just curious to hear from you all what your communities have developed. Tribal courts. Yep. Governing boards. Great. Tribal contemporary courts, tribal officials, tribal courts that include elders. Thank you for raising this. Trouble enforcing tribal court codes because of state interference. We usually try to use they try to use their tribal court and village councils. Great. So a lot of council work, creating positions for particular officials for enforcement, drafting of tribal ordinances. Great. Thank you all so much for sharing. Yeah, so we thought this would be really interesting because, I think traditionally everybody's mind kind of goes to a tribal court, right? Or courts that we see in our everyday life when we're watching, popular television, mainstream media. So we just wanted to see what folks are doing out there, as well as, really think about what is the potential out there for our communities to create really customized, responsive, really community centered justice systems that not only are there to help facilitate the enforcement of tribal laws, but that have been drafted, but it also enact procedures and processes that are reflective of those values as well. Yes, folks are others sharing other governing documents, tribal constitutions. Yep, wonderful. So tribal codes are just one piece of this overall idea of a justice response, or incident response, whatever, depending on the type of topic and issue that you're really focusing on. The format or the mode of those tribal law development could change. It could be a regulation, it could be an ordinance, it could be a statute, etc. So thank you all so much. Oh, it looks like Kelly might have had some trouble getting back into the webinar. So we'll try and see if we can get her back here. Let me just send her a quick note. All right, great. So we'll move on to our next piece and really think about the drafting process. So it is a process, right? That's the first point. It takes time. It takes resources. It's not just something where you have an idea or you're seeing an issue that you're encountering in your community and you want to draft a solution right away. Sometimes you have to talk about what are the various solutions, what are things that you're not thinking about that you should be, who's at the table, who's not at the table. And there's often, because codes are law, right? These are going to be enforceable formal rules that are going to be followed. The process to enact those things also takes time, in addition to the actual drafting of the code provision itself. Drafting is a commitment. So because it takes time and resources, it really does take that extra commitment to be able to work together to draft a code that is responsive to your community needs. And it's also really, really important work. It's really an opportunity for tribes to not only exercise their sovereignty, but also to really create laws that are community centered, that are going to reflect tribal specific values around safety. So it is really, really important work. And we know sometimes, folks get out there and they might start drafting and then have to take a break, or start drafting and leadership changes and they might have to start over. All of those things can be frustrating and a heavy burden to carry, but it's an important one. And if you have that commitment to really finding a solution or creating a right or a protection that you want for your community members, that commitment is going to see you through. So we just wanted to acknowledge that the drafting process can be time intensive and resource intensive, but it is very rewarding.
Can I add to that just a little bit? Sorry,
oh, you're
I'm
back, Kelly. Yay. Okay. Yes, please.
Yes, so sorry, everybody. When it rains, it pours, right? But on we go. I just want to say a word. I don't, some of you out there may not have ever drafted a code, and it doesn't have to be an entire code. It can just be a statute on something. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by what we're talking about here today. We're sort of just setting you up with some nuggets for beginning for you to think about. I want you to know that even the best drafters of laws create laws that none of us can understand, and also create laws with unintended consequences, right? Something usually negative happens. So I want you to give yourself some space and know that codes can also be modified. They can be amended, sort of tweaked to tailor it to your needs, what you intended. And I want you to think for a moment about Congress, because goodness knows we get these statutes that we cannot understand. Sometimes they're even unconstitutional. Very rarely do you get one that's super clear and achieves its goal right off the bat. And this is like our, the thing that we think about where the expert drafters go. It doesn't have to be like that. And what Heather said earlier, that's why it's just so important. It's more important for you to get your community, what your community needs to address and how your community wants to address it, and then have to come back and modify it. That's a more important process than you getting it perfect right off the bat. Okay, Heather, sorry.
Awesome, wonderful. No, thank you, Kelly. And I didn't mean to be a downer there, because folks take this up all the time, right? But sometimes on their own. You get a new assignment. I've had friends that are, lawyers, in-house counsel for tribes, and they get tasked with writing a whole code on a particular topic, and then they may not have even had a familiarity with the topic before. So this code development process, although it does take time and resources, it can be done by an individual. It can be done in a team. And it's just really, really important work. As we talked about earlier, it's really talking about conduct the type of behaviors that you want folks to be able to kind of strive towards or stay away from, depending on the type of code, the statute that you're writing. It can provide rights and protections for groups of folks in your community. So it's super important work. And one approach that we like to stress with communities is trying to take a team approach if possible, just so you can have as many folks at the table that might be impacted by the particular code or the particular statute that you're going to be drafting. It can help you expand education and outreach to your community on a particular topic. For example, if you want to tackle domestic violence in your community and folks really don't have an understanding of the power dynamics that exist when violence is enacted, particularly domestic violence, that brings you an opportunity to talk to your community about domestic violence and how violence is systemic, and talk about some of those ways that your justice system can be more victim-centered and more responsive to victim needs. A team approach could also kind of bring that shared, like, everybody's at the table, we're all going to do this together. So this is a community response, right? This is really going to reflect what our community wants to address and how we want to address it. So everybody kind of feels some shared ownership or shared connection in the process. A team approach can also help build trust, because sometimes when you're thinking about a code or a particular statute, it might involve the different departments and programs within your tribal community, and that might bring different groups together that aren't used to talking with each other, or maybe have different ideas or biases about their different programs and departments, and really come together for this important task of drafting that code or that statute. The team approach can also help kind of balance workload. If you've got a lot of folks that are if you've got a good amount of folks that are at the table, you can have folks with particular skill sets take on particular tasks to set up the code drafting process. If folks are really good at research, if folks are really good at being facilitators and timekeepers and keeping everybody on task, you can create subcommittees that can then tackle those tasks so that the drafting process does not feel as overwhelming. And then we've spoken about this already as well, but it really allows the space to bring in the folks that are going to be affected by this code, right? And who may often feel invisible or not heard in the community. So you can talk to your elders, your cultural knowledge keepers, invite them to be part of the process. You can incorporate the voices of affected subsets in your community. So if you want to be more responsive to survivors of violence, depending on that particular survivor's journey, if they are ready to come and be a part of this process, bring them in and bring them at the table and talk about how the justice system within the tribal community can be better, right? And so we thought that the image of the teepees here and having that up there is really reflective of how the intention that it takes in drafting tribal codes, but also in raising a teepee, right? And often that process can move faster when you have multiple people assist and different people have different roles within that process. And so we thought this image was a good example of how a team approach could really benefit tribal code development. Do you have anything to add, Kelly?
No, that was great. Thank you. I do want to toss out that we keep using DV and we do so much work in the DV area. But let me just toss out, what do you need things to protect your children? How do you feel about child custody? How do your kinship rules play into that? There's just a whole host of different areas that you might need tribal codes. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, and this, yes, this is still in the DV arena. Do you have a tribal statute that protects your advocates' records from lawyers being able to get at those to cross-examine the client that you're working with? I just, there are so many pieces here. You could either do one or you could do an entire code section on something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And so with those benefits, we wanted to provide some tips, and we're going to mention this also later in the presentation or underscore this, but a lot of this code development work and these processes and different approaches are outlined in a lot of our legal code resource publications. So those publications that we talked about at the beginning, there's even more discussion and in-depth thoughts around questions that you can ask yourself, exercises. They're all contained in our publications that are free and downloadable for you all. So these are just a couple of teamwork tips. You've got your team together. What are some tips to keeping the team healthy and moving forward? Try to avoid, even though you're being critical about, in critical, I'm meaning thinking about what your community is trying to respond to, what rights you're trying to create, ways that you're trying to better your justice system. Sometimes we can kind of fall into the trap of just finger pointing and maybe blaming other folks, like, oh, we tried to write this code 5 years ago under so and so's leadership. This could have been enacted. Da, 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 da. No, we're here now. Your team is together. They're focused on a particular trying to draft this particular code or statute. Let's focus on how the group is going to be a problem solving body, right? And not necessarily about finger pointing or blaming or just picking at resources, right? Because folks, we can talk all day sometimes about our leadership, right? And where we're seeing inefficiencies in our eyes. But with the team coming together to draft, it's really important to stay in that problem solving mode. You want to try and have representation from various groups. That's a big takeaway for today. If you haven't noticed, bring in representation, but bring in representation mindfully, right? You may not want to have a group of 20 that are focusing on a tribal code revision, because then you want to try and hear from every person there, each individual, every individual that's at the table. And sometimes you might not have the space to be able to really be effective by hearing 20 different voices. But with the voices that you do bring to the table, make sure there's equal representation. Make sure you're hearing from the different folks that are going to be part of your team, and make sure that they feel like they are contributing, because you also want that ownership in the process, right? To be able to keep the momentum moving forward. And of course, you want to make sure that the setting, when you all are working together, that's a setting of mutual respect. So sometimes that's involving setting expectations in your initial meeting around how you all want to conduct yourselves as a group. You all can talk a little bit more about what's going to be a safe environment for that process, and then really talk through how it's okay to acknowledge and understand and know going in that folks are going to have different opinions, and that's okay. And then it's really the groups that gives a task to the group to really discuss and really dive into the differences of opinion and how there might be compromise, or that ultimately the community wants to go in a particular way. And it's not really in a kind of judgmental manner either. It's all problem solving, right? It's all, we're trying to get at this problem, or we're trying to enhance our response in this way. Let's really think about how we can do that. So these are just a few tips. We're going to go through a couple more, I think.
Just want to make sure we get the voice of the victim if it's going to be a crime or a code that deals with victims' rights or protections that you want to give someone that is a victim of a crime, that you make sure the victim has healed enough Your advocate will be instrumental in maybe even making suggestions so that you get the voice of someone who's actually gone through the process.
Yep. So we're still on teamwork here and some tips. Agendas can be really useful, and really think about what are some mutual concerns or interests, or what are themes popping up in your discussions as you're trying to engage in this process. Would a vision be helpful? And developing a vision statement for the team and the co-drafting product, a vision for that, such as a safe community with healthy families. That's the vision that this team is trying to reach by enacting or drafting tribal code. And then with those kind of conversations, really basing agenda items and discussions on mutual concerns, shared interests, on vision, it can create trust within that group, right? You've already established that this is going to be a safe place and how this is going to be a safe place. So just reinforce that by also continuing to keep the momentum on things where folks can have some buy-in and some interest. You can examine the way things are, right? We can talk about those things, point out where there are inadequacies or where we want to see improvement, but also explore ways of expanding and explore ways of like, how can we think more creatively about this, right? Let's hear from so-and-so in the child welfare department. What are you all seeing lately around this issue? Right. And that might be able to spark conversations and thoughts around how the code can be structured. Right. And of course, the process may not be easy. There might be some frustrations or difficult times, but that outside of the box thinking and hearing from everybody's voices can help bring different perspectives in that are going to be really valuable and make your code draft that much stronger. Okay. I think this might be our last tips page for teamwork tips. But be prepared to share resources and the work that you're doing. Share the burdens with each other. Subcommittees can work on different tasks to share that. Be honest about funding and what could be available to support folks' time and efforts in drafting the code, or everybody, maybe it's an ad hoc grassroots group of community that are getting together. But outlining that commitment, right, and what resources are available are going to be really helpful to give you some timetables, as well as think about what other resources you might need to get to be able to get the code to where you want it to be. Again, all team members should be allowed input into the discussions. Try and bring that equal voice, right? Implement things maybe like step up, step back during conversations if particular folks are dominating a discussion. Really try and get all of your team members' input. And then consider traditional and cultural appropriate strategies. Is when you're gathering with each other, is it important to have food? Is it important to have water? Is it important to gather outside and not be in a building? Think through those things that are going to be most appropriate for your group, and also maybe reflect some of your cultural values and understandings. Maybe it's around a fire or tableside visiting with tea. Just think through those things, because those things, again, will provide you a strong foundation for the group to continue to move forward and continue to feel comfortable, to continue to trust each other, and really get a strong draft at the end of the day. So I think this might be it for teamwork tips section. There might be one more final slide just to kind of bring back that image of the TP again, where you might expect, if you're working on a team, if you do get your team together, you'll probably be working with each other a lot. You might be seeing each other, you might be tired of seeing each other at some points, depending on the structure of your meetings and how often you're meeting and where you're meeting, etc. And as I mentioned, all of these tips and a more thorough discussion around the team approach to tribal code drafting can be found in our TLPI resources. There's a particularly thorough discussion in one of our latest resources, which is on drafting laws on crimes against children. So again, this effort is well worth it. Even if you're working by yourself, you can work through this guide and do the exercises yourself. You can contact TLPI if you need to and pop, popcorn questions over our way. But we're such big advocates of, again, this community-driven process, and a community-driven process that's thoughtful and mindful of community values, cultural appropriateness, and mutual respect of all those involved in the process. Okay, so the actual getting in there and putting some words to paper, that's where we're going to transition for the next part of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Thanks, Heather. The only thing I would add, and it may be on down here a little bit, is not only your customs, your traditions, but also your language. If it's being used, trying to work that in your code as well, because sometimes that it's difficult to translate some words into English, so you'll get a fuller, deeper meaning by using your own language. Okay, general tips. Consider drafting a vision statement that Heather mentioned earlier. A vision statement, in my mind, drafting codes in times where there's a smidgen of conflict, disagreement, we can't quite get it together, get on the same page. This vision statement is a grounding stone. It's a touchstone so that you can go back and say, remember when we drafted this vision statement? This is what we're working for. We have got to find some common ground. We've got to work together. We have to find workarounds. We won't agree on everything, but we agreed on this. And you go back to that and then begin to work your way forward again, taking steps forward again. We do have a great piece on how to draft a vision statement and some example vision statements in a TLPI publication called Domestic Violence Courts Dockets. It's how to set those up. It goes a little bit into it goes a lot into what Heather talked about earlier, the teamwork, the team approach, all of those things are in there, but there is a segment on drafting a vision statement there as well you might find helpful. You're going to need to get ready, and you're going to need to gather some things so you don't have to keep getting up and disrupting things to go find things like I just did here on the webinar. But some things you're going to need: your constitution, your tribal constitution and bylaws. You need to have that handy. And then you're also going to need whatever code you're drafting, you're going to need a copy of your current tribal code so that you know what will need to be changed. Are there things in there you can go ahead and use, or does everything need to be changed? Or do you not have a code on this at all? You're still going to need that constitution because you have to stay within the parameters of that. If you're reviewing your tribal codes, you want to look for gaps, because you'll have this whole team sitting there saying, this is the topic we need to address. This is the conduct we need to address. And here are the gaps in our code. This is what happened. Somebody went to court. The judge couldn't give her this relief because it's not a relief that's authorized in our code. We need to change that. So lots of different things you can think about where there may be gaps. If there are conflicts, sometimes I can think of conflicts a variety of different ways. One code says this, the other piece of the code says this. You can't reconcile that. I can tell you, as a former tribal judge, I looked to the tribal code. There are pieces at the very beginning of the code that sometimes, I hope, that would tell me what the people are trying, the community, what their goals are, what they hold sacred, what's the most important thing to them. And I'm supposed to look back at that as I attempt to interpret these codes. So we're looking for conflicts. We're looking to borrow language that we like. We can look at other tribal code examples and pick out pieces that fit perfectly with what you think you're trying to accomplish. You can borrow language. And again, we keep saying this, be sure to include tribal culture, tribal beliefs, tribal practices, because guess what? When you get this beautiful work of art done, it's really not going to be so helpful if the tribal community didn't know about it, and if they won't accept it at the end of the day. So we're going to keep everybody informed. And you might want to plan that through as you get a little further with the team, how you're going to bring this to the community. Let them know you're working on things. And you want to review any federal laws that might provide some parameters or limitations to what you're trying to accomplish. So we want to be sure we're paying attention to those things. Have them handy. Heather said earlier, you're going to have all kinds of skill sets. Probably need someone that's the holder, the keeper of the documents. Bring these things to almost every session. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And then I was just going to add too, a note on another way to interpret borrowed language too, is that maybe your tribe borrowed a code from the state or another jurisdiction, and now you're going back to it and you're saying, hey, this is not what we're intending to do. And so you might want to scan for those pieces during this initial assessment process, when you're reviewing your tribal constitution and your tribal codes. You might want to look for like, oh, hey, that reference doesn't really make a lot of sense. Where did we get that from? And then you're like, oh, we borrowed it from the state, or we borrowed it from so-and-so. And then that can kind of orient you to possible gaps or conflicts or issues that you might want to address in your draft.
An example of that I'm thinking of that I see so often, Heather, very problematic, first of all, in my opinion, wholesale just incorporating tribal law or federal law. I'm not tribal law, state law or federal law into your tribal code is the definition of domestic violence. In many states, it requires a physical act of violence. Yeah. Many tribes take such an expansive view of how this power and control could be exercised. So you want to make sure your code is reflecting what your tribe believes, the tribe's position on this topic. Okay, let's move into the writing. Some writing tips for you all here. I'm trying to keep my eye on the time too, Heather. Write simply and carefully. Doesn't that sound glorious? It is really not helpful for you to use Latin. Who understands that anyway? I mean, some of us have had to memorize some of it, but I'm like, why on earth? I get it, but why would we have to keep using that today? Write simply in language that you feel everyone can understand, and write carefully and mindfully. Try not to put too many words. Don't use any more words than you really need to. Write purposefully, focused. Oh my, I struggle with that issue myself. Focus. What are we trying to accomplish here? Maybe someone needs to hand out a piece of paper for the entire drafting team to say, this is our focus today. Keep looking at this paper, because people want to take it way too deep or get way ahead of it. Keep everybody in. Research efficiently. Heather said earlier, we want you to look at your constitution. We want you to have your tribal code there. If there are other tribal codes that share many of the same beliefs and customs as your tribe, you might want to get a copy of their code too, just to see how they did it. So familiarize yourself also with the customs and traditions that you can weave into your tribal code. Remember, these have to be written. Not all customs and traditions are amenable to being written down. So you're going to pick the ones that you can put in writing. There's no rush. Well, I hope you aren't put under the gun with the rush, because this is way too difficult and complex for you to try to do it in a hurry. It's so much easier if you can take your time. Don't rush to recreate the wheel. Get those examples, look at them, cherry pick what you like out of them. And again, give yourself some space. It may not be perfect the first time. It's no reflection of a failure if you have to come back and amend this later. Don't be afraid of that. Next slide. More writing tips. Masterful legislation requires teamwork. Everybody may have a different word they want to use. You're going to get together, going to collaborate. Again, keeping it simple and easy to understand, I think. And I say that as a lawyer with over 35 years of experience, there are still federal laws that I look at and I think, oh my God, this is going to take me 30 minutes to even figure out what this says. That's not good. That is not good. Keep these things tight and use language that everybody can understand. Develop a drafting style. You want to kind of keep things uniform, how you're starting out, how you're ending. Be patient. Draft the statute first. You can think about the sentencing later. So get the statutes like you want them first. And in that vein of sentencing, be mindful of the Indian Civil Rights Act and the requirements of the Tribal Law and Order Act, which you'll find in the Indian Civil Rights Act. I want to say it's at 1302C. It gives the defendants, if you're going to sentence to more than 1 year, it gives the defendant certain rights that have to be present in your tribal court system and in your code. So just be mindful of that. You might want to have a copy of the Indian Civil Rights Act there with you when you're drafting. It's not a very long document. It's fairly easy to understand too, I think. And be sure to include a date that you want this statute to take effect, a date, or you can use something like upon the signing of the resolution by tribal council. If you have to have your codes approved by the BIA, it might be the date that BIA approves it, whatever's appropriate. But give the judge a starting point. From this day forward, this law applies. Next slide. Don't forget about a severability clause. That's important. Let me explain to you what that is. So a severability clause, you probably have already seen them. It says something like this. If a court should find one section of this statute or one section of this code unconstitutional because it violates the tribal constitution or because, the judge feels it violates the Indian Civil Rights Act, all of the rest of the clauses and pieces of the code stay in place. They're still good. If you don't have this, sometimes what could happen is one little piece of the statute is held to be unconstitutional and the whole code goes down. So it's really important to get this piece in there. Next slide. And I think I'll turn it over to you maybe, or is this still me?
Oh, just trying to unmute there. I think it's both of us now.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Kelly. And those are just some general tips, right? Like y'all are going to find your individual flows, the process that's going to work for you all. So those are just some general tips for writing and some general tips for working as a team. And so now we wanted to just pose some considerations more broadly. You all are already interested in this topic. You're already here with us on this webinar, listening to us and engaging with us. So what are just some overall considerations to think about when drafting a particular code? And so one question you might ask yourself is who? Who are you trying to protect with the code that you're drafting? Who could potentially be impacted by the code that you're drafting? Right? So just kind of think about like these laws aren't necessarily those things that are, out there and, put on the web or in our code of conduct or whatever, right? These are laws that actually are going to have an effect on day-to-day livelihoods of people, right? So at the end of the day, who are you trying to protect? Who might be impacted? And then for the actual code drafting process, who can provide some needed insight? Is everybody at the table who would be really essential or who could provide some creative ideas for us? Are there elders? Are there knowledge keepers that we could bring? Knowledge keepers who we could bring. So these are just some general considerations around the who when you're drafting tribal code.
I'll take the what, if you don't mind. Okay. Yeah. So the consideration of the what, the community, again, we keep going back to that, need to identify the issues that need to be addressed. You can do that in a whole host of different ways by a multidisciplinary group that's drafting the code. You can send out surveys to the community. And what types of issues are really prevalent in your tribal community? It reminds me of a story. Sat down with a tribal prosecutor and a group of other folks that were interested in making some changes to the tribal code on domestic violence. And he said, the tribal prosecutor said, well, we don't have any domestic violence here in our community. Do you see what had to happen? There had to be education. So be patient. We mentioned that earlier. Be patient. Not everybody may be aware of the issues that are going on in the community. So be sure that you're trying to take the pulse of what's going on in the community. How would the tribal court, law enforcement, the components of the tribal justice system respond to those issues? Are you thinking that remedies, civil remedies? Are you thinking this should be a crime with criminal penalties to it? How would you want this to be addressed? And then think about considerations that are unique to the victim. We mentioned this before. I always think of confidentiality and protecting those advocates' records. That is so important because it's been drilled into me by tribal advocates that protecting victim information is directly connected to victim safety. So I want you all to have a great solid statute that's going to protect your tribal victim advocates' records. Also, you know, what if it's a child victim of crime? It's so important to keep them protected, to keep confidentiality protected. If there are if you don't have any victims' rights, you should go look. This is a great time. We're at a great time with VAWA 2022 to be really thinking about getting those codes tightened up and strengthened if that's needed. Be thinking about victims' rights. And Heather and I, together with other TLPI members, worked on that Crimes Against Children's guide to drafting codes for that. So important if you are going to be addressing child victims that you put some protections in there for them. Don't make them, you know, a defense attorney wants to put the child on the stand. Put some protections in there to keep that child protected, to keep the victim protected as well, especially in cases of domestic violence. And tribal protection orders. Do you have those? Do you have a code that addresses that? Do you have statutes that make it a crime if those provisions the judge has ordered are violated? So just being mindful of what exactly your focus is.
Mm-hmm. And then I just wanted to offer to underscore the point around what types of issues are prevalent in your community. These processes around community needs assessments or building strategic plans for your community are often supported by federal grant funds. And so if you have a federal grant opportunity where you're able to do a community needs assessment or try and build a strategic plan, there are funding sources out there that are available to kind of help you identify what some of the issues might be. Of course, there are other mechanisms, communities connecting with each other, talking with elders, talking with different folks. But I just wanted to emphasize that those two processes also kind of set you up for future grant funds as well. Agencies like to see strategic plans, needs assessments that were done that could also help you find further funds to support your code drafting also. So just wanted to add that in there. So why, right? We're trying to address an issue. We're trying to make communities safer. We're trying to protect victims. We're trying to protect children. We're trying to protect elders. There's a larger issue that's impacting your community. That's your why, right? You're trying to protect your community. You're trying to exercise our tribal sovereignty and make sure that tribal laws are reflective of tribal values and understandings, right? There's no need to replicate the state. There's no need to replicate the federal government. There may be considerations that you have to keep in mind, federal laws that may be applicable, as we mentioned before, but tribal law, that should be reflective of the tribe's understandings and approach and values and worldviews, right? So there's the why behind drafting is also to formalize those understandings and show a government commitment to certain issues, and show that the tribal justice system, or the tribe's sense of justice, even not even specifically a tribal justice system, but just thinking about what a tribe's the scope of justice or how that's going to be defined for the community. All those types of discussions can be reflected in a code draft, in a statute, in thinking about what statutes could be addressing different issues in your community. So there's a lot of whys out there. And so we highly encourage folks to look out there, be creative, to think about what gaps are there, if there's any conflicts that you're seeing in your work. But the why really is going back to how we started this presentation, which was around tribal sovereignty and exercising self-governance and maintenance of our communities. All right. And then how, which was a question Kelly had already led into, right? How would your drafts become law? After you've done all the work drafting, what's that process for it to become enforceable by your tribe's justice system mechanisms? And this question will be unique to your tribe, right? Because as we discussed in we shared in our chat question earlier, different tribes have different justice systems. They have different justice seeking mechanisms. So it all depends on your tribal community. And there's actually I don't know if it's the next picture. It might be, it might be helpful to think about who that contact person is maybe you have to run through things through the general counsel or in-house counsel's office. Who's the contact that you'd have to eventually get there to share your draft with? So to think through some of those questions and to really help the group come together, or not even a group, if someone's just assigned to be a tribal code drafter, list the individuals or agencies that are going to be part of the code adoption process. Do you have to go through tribal council? Do you have to go through BIA? And really map that out so that you have a clear understanding of how the draft is going to become law. Any more notes on this particular worksheet, Kelly?
No, just to say that it is an example that we've pulled from the tribal laws on crimes against children. You can kind of get a feel for the flavor of the TLPI publications that Heather was saying. We ground in tribal sovereignty, we ground in teamwork, even if the team is really, really small. And there are worksheets, there are exercises. It is a workbook. And hopefully if you go through it all, you will end up with what you really want your code to look like, what you really want your statutes to look like.
Yeah, and this is just a continued visual from that same worksheet that the little snippet came from in the previous slide, talking about how y'all worked so hard, you got your final draft, approval process is coming, then submit for approval. And then you get to celebrate. It's approved and adopted and enforceable by your community. So it's just a little visual to kind of help you think through the code adoption process. But again, as Kelly mentioned, this is kind of just a peek into how TLPI tries to structure our resources, particularly on code development. All right, so we've done a lot of talking now, and thank you so much for hanging with us. And we appreciate your time and attention. And so we wanted to kind of wrap up the presentation just with looking at some examples and talking through some different pieces here. So Kelly, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, the example we chose, just to give you an idea, everybody, was criminal child neglect. Again, this is coming from our Crimes Against Children publication. And so do you see how this could be helpful if you're wanting to draft a code like this, but you really kind of don't know how to start? We're giving you, and we usually try to give at least 3 tribal examples. Sometimes there's commentary with it telling you what's different between the 3 versions that we've selected. But here you can just kind of look at Swinomish, and they are telling you this is their code on offenses involving children with criminal neglect. You can kind of see what their community says. Hey, if you don't furnish food, shelter, supervision, or care for a child that you are responsible for, you may be guilty of criminal neglect, criminal child neglect. So you can kind of just get an example there. And it depends on how you want to number things and things like that. I wouldn't really worry about that when you're at this early stage, just trying to get these examples together so you can pull from them and discuss them with your group. Next slide.
Yep. And then I just wanted to add in this little snippet, you'll see we omitted certain sections, but you'll see subsection C and D there went further to define further some of the language that you see in section A. So C, a clarified care includes sending a child to school when school attendance is legally required, or the definition of neglect shall be interpreted broadly to protect the best interest of the child. So there's just little things in there that you, as y'all are thinking about your codes that you're drafting, you can put those kind of guide rails, as Kelly mentioned earlier. So we have another example for you too, just to talk through a little bit. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, this is from Pasquiyaki, and this is victims' rights. We also have a new guide out, fairly new, on how to draft victims' rights codes. So again, free for download on our website. And this is the right to be heard. We chose random rights that victims have. So this one is the right to be heard. And perhaps the court doesn't want to hear from the victim, or in a criminal case thinks it's disrupted, thinks it's not protecting the defendant's rights. Okay, so if you want the victim, if they want to, the victim wants to be able to stand up and have a say, or the victim's representative to be able to stand up and have a say, put it in the statute. That's really the only way to ensure, with changes in administration and judges, that this is going to happen. And you can kind of see how Pasquiyaki starts off with saying, these rules shall be construed. That's a signal to a tribal judge. This is how you should be interpreting this, to preserve and protect victims' rights to justice and due process. A victim of a crime has a right to be heard upon request. Again, recognizing victim autonomy. Not all victims want to be heard, but some want to. And if they do, they're going to get a right. But it's at particular points in the criminal trial. At a proceeding involving a post-arrest release, are they going to let the perpetrator out of jail? The victim says, I want to stand up and have a say. I want to tell the judge why I'm afraid. A negotiated plea deal or sentencing. The victim has a right to stand up and say, I don't think that's enough. This is how this affected my life. Again, not every victim will want to do that, but this is Pasquiyaki saying, if you want to, you have this right, and the judge will see to it that you get these rights. To confer with prosecution, upon request, again, before or after the crime against the victim has been charged, before trial, or before any other disposition of the case. And this keeps that victim in the loop and being heard in cases where there's a plea agreement between the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Before that plea agreement can be sentenced or accepted by the judge, the victim, if they want, will have an opportunity to come in and have a say. So that's kind of the gist of that statute. You can see how that's protective, but again, not so protective that if the victim doesn't want to, that they're going to get penalized. It's up to them.
Great.
Next slide.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I think with that, we are coming to the end of our presentation. As we have stressed multiple times during today's webinar, we have resources. So we really want to make sure that you all know about them and that hopefully they're useful, you find them useful. We've got a variety of publications and web resources, as well as Redwind as well. So we encourage you to check out their website. These are just some snippets of some of our resources here. Lately, we've been really uplifting this publication that's a little bit older, but really some gems in here. It's our Listening to the Grandmothers video resource guide, and it really reflects conversations that our folks and the drafters of that resource had conversations and discussions with grandmothers and about how to incorporate custom and tradition into tribal code and other justice response systems. So we've got plenty up there. You can visit our website, home.tlpi.org. We have a publications tab that will take you to all of our different publications, and it's separated by subject or series. You've heard us talk about this resource a lot today, which is one of our more recent tribal legal code resources. This one is our guide for drafting or revising tribal laws on crimes against children. It is a pretty hefty resource, I gotta say, but there's a lot of really good information in there. And we took tried a new strategy in terms of thinking through our exercises. There's a lot of great visuals and flow charts that we worked with our good friend Michelle, who we gave a shout out to earlier in the presentation. So we really are proud of how this resource came together, and we hope that it could be a useful guide for you.
And Heather, isn't this the first resource we really put a chapter on drafting, on code drafting?
So. Yes.
Yeah.
Dedicated,
so
a dedicated part. Yep. Kelly, you want to talk about this one? You already talked about it a little bit.
This is a condensed guide for drafting tribal victims' rights codes. Even if you have some and you just want to revisit or flip through this to see if there's anything you might want to add, again, I would encourage you to have your tribal victim advocate at the table, or the tribal victim advocate may pick this up and this will become their cause. So again, same sort of formatting. I think we did less of a workbook approach to this, didn't we, Heather, and more with just tribal examples and some discussion questions.
Yep. Yes. And then one more here to highlight for you, focused on juvenile delinquency laws. There was a recent update to this one, a pretty narrow in scope update, just to update on some pieces of legislation. But this one is also a treasure trove of resources. It is another hefty one. It's quite, I'm blanking on the page numbers now, but there's plenty of chapters in there that have lots of really great discussion about the juvenile justice process. There actually is a dedicated chapter in here as well around, again, that corporation of culture and tribal values. So we highly recommend taking a look at this resource as well. Again, available on our website. You can also access this publication through our Tribal Youth Resource Center, which has a dedicated website, tribalyouthprogram.org. And so here's a shout out as well, through our partnership with Redwind and some other grant resources that TLPI has available. We are available to help with code review. Many tribes have asked us to review their domestic violence codes, full tribal codes, to ensure they're prepared, particularly for exercising VAWA 2013, Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction, and VAWA 2022, Special Tribal Criminal Jurisdiction. We've also looked at some other topics. We've worked with tribes recently around a tribal protection order ordinance, even looking at the form and how the protection order looks. So just, feel free to reach out to us. Chia is going to be our main contact for those requests to make sure we can try and do as much as possible for free or at no cost. So we highly encourage you all to reach out to us. And we know we're with you for 2 other webinars focused on this topic, but in the meantime, feel free to reach out to us. And with that, we have 2 upcoming webinars in the series. The next one's going to be October 27th, and we'll particularly be digging into tribal custom and tradition and opportunities to weave that into your code and ways to go about that. And then our final webinar in the series will be on November 3rd. So please look out for registration, and please share the flyer and information about the webinar with other colleagues and people in your networks that you think would benefit from attending. And I think this is our last slide here, just with contact information if you ever need to reach out to us. And with that, I think we've got a good few minutes here. If folks have any questions, thoughts, is there anything that particularly stuck with you today that we've discussed? We'd love to hear from you before we close out the webinar. Stop share so I can, there we go. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in the chat or Q&A. So with that, we want to say thank you so much for joining with us, joining here and being with us today. And we look forward to being with you and the 2 other webinars that we have coming up. Say hi to Kelly if you're going to go to the OVW Tribal Summit next week. And Kelly and Bonnie Claremont will be giving a presentation on code development with a particular focus on VAWA 2022. We also have some other staff and consultants attending to give a plenary on the reauthorization. So please look out for our folks, say hello. And thank you so much again.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Heather.
Take care.
Thank you both. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you all thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel, and you can also find our previous recordings there. And as Heather mentioned, we do indeed have a website, which is red-wind.net. You do need to add that dash in, otherwise you'll get a casino. But yes, in closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.